Good afternoon and welcome to Federated Farmers Policy Presents. Today's topic is on foot and mouth and what we all need to know. It's fantastic to have a great lineup of speakers to help us work through this, and it's fantastic to have you all join the call. I know it's a really busy time of year, so thanks for making the effort. I'm Wayne Langford, Federated Farmers Vice President and also Biosecurity spokesperson for Feds. I apologise early. My reception here in Golden Bay is a little average today, potentially because it's wet and flooded, but who knows why. Moving on. Today's webinar will be recorded, so if you do have to leave or if you have things essential to do on the farm and you can't stay around, be assured that you can watch it later on. Obviously, as I mentioned, it's a busy time of year, so thank you for all coming along and being a part of this. The procedure today is we're going to have about a 20-minute presentation from the team and followed by a lengthy Q&A session. So I hope it gives everyone an opportunity to have their questions answered. Now I'd like to introduce the speakers that we have today. Coming from the MPI Biosecurity team, first of all, we have Stuart Anderson, Deputy Director General. Here's Stu. We have Ed Zirkle, Veterinary Response Officer, who will also be speaking. Mike Inglis, Northern Regional Commissioner up there and working around the Auckland Airport and everywhere else. And Steve Ham, the Program Director for Foot and Mouth Disease. Yeah. So I'm not going to talk for much longer. I really want to get into this, and like I say, no doubt many of you do too. Sit back and I hope you enjoy. Please add as many questions as you can to the chat, and we'll get them onto the team after this presentation, which, like I said, will be about 20 minutes, and we can answer any questions you've got from there. Right, Stu, I'll hand over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Wayne. And yeah, thanks. Hi everyone. Thanks for this opportunity. Really great for us here at MPI to have this opportunity to talk through foot and mouth disease, what we're doing about it, and our plan. So I do appreciate the time. Thank you. Just do have an apology from Mary van Andel, who's our Chief Veterinary Officer. Something's come up urgently that she wasn't able to join us, but we're in safe hands with Ed Zirkle, who's been leading our disease work in M. bovis, as well as experience from the UK managing FMD. So if we move on to the next slide. Look, I'll just open up. We'll run through this as quickly as we can to allow that time for some good Q&A and discussion. But really just a bit of a what is FMD? How do we think it could get here? What's the risk to New Zealand? What are we doing about it? And finishing off with what everyone can do to help in the keeping it out of New Zealand focus. So if we just move on to the next slide, then please. So look, just a few key points to emphasise. Firstly, obviously, we don't have foot and mouth disease in New Zealand. We're free from FMD. We have never had it here, and that's the way we want it to stay. So all of our work is really very much focused on stopping it from getting here. So a whole lot of work we do offshore in terms of controls of things that can and can't come here, and then work on the border, which we'll talk about. Despite the Indonesia outbreak of foot and mouth disease that popped up in May, overall the risk of FMD arriving or getting into New Zealand still is an overall low risk. We have everything in our biosecurity system is really focused on keeping certainly foot and mouth disease out, other diseases as well. So prior to Indonesia, it's very much top of our list, foot and mouth disease, and all the things we have on the border and offshore have been around keeping it out. What I would say though is that the Indonesian situation is a new country in the broader region that hasn't had it for a long period of time, many decades. So it's a bit closer. The overall risk is still low, but our alert level is heightened as a result of that. As I say, it's right up at the top of our list, FMD. We're monitoring the Indonesian situation really closely. We are working really closely with our counterparts in Australia who are also really focused on this as well. It's absolutely a good time to raise awareness. And as I say, the alert level is heightened and the awareness, New Zealand's reopening as well. People are travelling which hasn't been happening for the last few years. As I say, we're working closely across, particularly Australians, close contact with Indonesians as well. And just you probably know this already, but foot and mouth disease is not a human health or food safety issue. It's very much an animal welfare issue. So if we just move on to the next slide then. So why is it a concern? Well, it's highly contagious, foot and mouth disease. All cloven-hoofed animals, cattle, pigs, sheep, deep, goats, alpaca, spreads really easily, and it would have a major impact us in terms of our trade. So our foot and mouth disease-free status allows us to trade easily with a whole lot of countries. Our trade relies on that. Losing that status would mean certainly an initial halting of that trade to then try and reopen the markets. So it's definitely something we want to keep out and not have here. It also would be a very big, large response, most likely, major impacts across New Zealand, and the work to eradicate it and get back to a free status would be substantial. So wide-ranging. So definitely, like I say, our focus is to keep it out and do everything we can to keep it out. However, we also need to plan and be ready to respond swiftly were it to ever get you in the worst case scenario. So I'll move on and hand over to Ed Thurkel to talk a bit about the global context and a bit more on FMD itself on the next slide. So over to you, Ed.
Thank you, Stu. So good morning, everybody. So as many of you will be aware, foot and mouth disease is endemic in many countries. In fact, it amounts to 70% of the global herd, including China and Malaysia. And they manage FMD through a variety of different methodologies, including use of vaccination in some countries. Other countries, such as the UK, have experienced outbreaks, which they have successfully managed to get under control and eradicate. The most notable one of which was in 2001, and a slightly smaller outbreak in 2007. So countries with FMD can export to some markets, but only with certain conditions, such as to America with heat-treated products, etc. FMD has the potential to have an immense impact on global trade. And what's causing us concern at the moment is that outbreaks have been reported in Indonesia, and we understand continue to spread through those islands, which is placing the northern borders of Australia and other countries that people from those areas travel to at greater risk than historic. Have the next slide, please. So how could FMD get here? Well, as Stuart said, the risk is low due to our strict import health standards for risk goods and combined with our robust border protection means, and I'm sure Mike will be saying something more about that later. The most likely route for us into New Zealand would be the illegal importation of risk goods, such as meat or animal products, because the virus can survive even in cooked meat. Exposure, should it happen, would most likely be via the feeding of these contaminated animal products fed to pigs. But in order for it to cause infection, the virus must still be viable and it must be of sufficient quantity to initiate an infection. And it's why our swill feeding measures, so the proper treatment of feedstuffs that are fed to pigs are cooked at high enough temperatures and at high enough pressures, and that they don't contain meat products. The particular risk that we have with pigs is that those that are intensively housed do have, they excrete a large amount of virus in aerosol, which has been demonstrated to spread some distance in the air. And therefore they present a particular risk to cattle and other cloven hoof animals that surround. So it's of particular importance that we know where our pigs are and that we keep them closely monitored. Next slide, I believe. So over to Mike, thank you.
Kia ora everyone, Mike Ingalls, the Northern Regional Commissioner. In terms of keeping it out with border measures, as you can see there, for passengers through the air pathway, we 100% risk assessment, 100% of luggage checked and carry on for all passengers is x-rayed on arrival. So that was the strength of our system before. In addition, for the awareness and also to, in terms of Indonesia, for all passengers arriving from Indonesia, We have an enhanced risk assessment, footwear checks, and passengers exit through disinfectant foot mats. And there's also additional prohibitions on personal consignments of cooked and treated meat from Indonesia. To give you an idea of scale, in a week in August, 70,967 passengers came through our airport. 812, just over 1% of those came through Indonesia in the last 30 days. The vast majority of them via Australia in terms of their aspects of it. So just to give you an idea of scale of where that's been. Within the cargo space, we've got additional biosecurity measures for all cargo from Indonesia. So every container, so that same week, 152 containers arrived from Indonesia. My staff opened and inspected all of those containers within that period in time. And that again is an enhanced measure to make sure that we're hyper vigilant in managing this accordingly. In terms of mail, as you can see in the picture, all mail from Indonesia is separated within the International Mail Centre and Express Freight, and it's a dedicated process where everything's x-rayed and our dogs go across every item of mail. Thank you. Next slide, please. In addition to that, we've obviously enhanced, as you would expect, some of our targeted campaigns. For those inbound passengers coming through, we've had an extensive education campaign at pre-departure airports, in flight and on arrival. So the biosecurity video that gets played in passengers, we've also enhanced that with specific messaging about FMD. When passengers arrive in airports, there's also the audible alerts in terms of foot and mouth disease, and obviously banners, etc., as well as electronic signage, as you can see a couple of the examples on the slide. Again, farmers with foreign workers arriving in New Zealand, we're working with the farming sector on messaging, again, and ensuring that those passengers or those who come across don't go onto farms across the next week. Transitional facility operators, ports and empty container yards. Again, we've had regular stakeholder updates and advice for those that receive empty containers and full containers, and making sure we're working with our industry partners and they're aware of what we're doing to enhance our checks at this stage. And again, we've also had general public media releases, social media. What we've actually found in practice, a lot of those passengers I've just described are fully aware of foot and mouth degrees when they come and approach our staff and risk assessment, which is a good sign. Thank you. I'll pass you on to Steve Ham now.
Good afternoon, everyone. A bit about the task force. So in the media, you may have heard there is a task force been generated to look at foot and mouth disease. And if I had to summarise a slide, it's about coordination of effort. The task force has been put in place specifically for a rapid sprint, you could say, to increase our level of preparedness and accelerate the projects that are underway. So currently we have 15 work streams and 26 separate projects that are looking at different elements of FMD preparedness. The reason for this is that the landscape has changed over the last few years. We've been through Mycoplasma bovis, and we've also been through the COVID pandemic, and both of those responses have provided some really useful lessons that need to be incorporated into the foot and mouth disease plans. Probably the key thing here is we're not starting from a zero-sum game. FMD has been worked on at MPI and industry as well for the last 20 years. So that threat and risk has been there for a long time. It's about refreshing those plans that are in place and making sure as prepared as we can be with those lessons learned from previous responses. We're working very closely with the GIA partners, so industry partners in there as well, and we've also got a big stream of work with all of government. So if anything COVID has taught us, it's that connectivity that's required across government, managing a response of this size if it should ever be needed. Next slide, please. So in supplementing these plans, we're boosting what we've done, but there's a lot of work already being undertaken over previous years. One of the key findings from the Mycoplasma bovis review was looking at veterinarian expertise. So a lot of energy is going into working with the private sector as well currently, and how they can be used in an FMD response more readily for when they're needed. Stock movement tracing, something that you'll all be familiar with, Nate, particularly in dairy and cattle, is really supporting that tracing of animal movements, which would be incredibly useful in an FMD outbreak. Testing, MPI ourselves, we've got a biocontainment laboratory at Wallaceville now. That wasn't in place 3 years ago, but that lab now is in place and does have the capacity to do 7,000 tests a day, which is off current modelling as well, would be required. So that's a new piece of infrastructure that's in place that would be used. Vaccines have a pre-purchase vaccine bank which sits offshore, and depending on the strain and typing, we have access ready to go for vaccines should they be required. And then obviously working with third-party providers such as Assure Quality and other panel members there as well to look at ensure we've got stores and equipment and supplies ready to deploy. So there's a rapid amount of work going in here at the moment. Next slide. Welfare, key points, talking about lessons learned from COVID with the farming sector. Identification, what we're trying to implement into these new plans is welfare. It's really taking a bit of a farmer-centric approach to the plans that are in place currently. And one of those key lessons were the identification and training of case managers should it occur. Definitely been recognised that if something was to occur, such as FMD, the last thing in dealing with the issues at the time farmers require is we're dealing with multiple people. So having a single point of contact and case managers is vitally important. Really looking at support services. Once again, COVID has taught us this. So welfare matters such as the wage subsidies and so on. There's a lot of work going on across government now with that and linking in with MSD and inland revenue on how this could be established or what it would look like in the case of an FMD outbreak. So the welfare support has been covered. It currently wasn't in plans beforehand, but there is a definite planning and response process that's being worked on currently for this. What I'll do now is just hand over to Ed just to talk through the rapid response strategy or what it could look like.
So the rapid response strategy involves, once we've reached the threshold of confirming infection with FMD in a susceptible animal in New Zealand, there would be a national livestock standstill, which means that all susceptible animals must stay on the current property that they're on. There are rules around animals in transit. Usually they go on to their intended destination. Some may return to their property of origin if it's much closer than the destination or if it's a sale yard. It would, of course, also impact movements across water, including the Cook Strait, and there'd be no movements between north and south. We are adopting a stamping out, as in eradication policy after a standstill. And I know there's been some questions about vaccination, and we can perhaps talk about that a little bit in the question and answers. At this point, we have to determine the extent and distribution and scale of the infection that's in the country in order to be able to ensure that any controls that we have in place are proportionate to the amount of risk. And so we start off big and then we scale back. And in doing that, we declare areas and movement controls and controls on fomites, equipment, vehicles, etc. Stock that are infected are destroyed, and that has to be done quickly and cleanly. And then there's an extensive cleaning and disinfection protocol that needs to be followed once carcasses have been disposed of. The potential for vaccination is there. As Steve has said, we've got access to a vaccine bank offshore, and plans are being reviewed and refreshed to see how we would make use of vaccination in this country. It does have some implications as far as trade is concerned, and the preference for New Zealand would be that we eradicate without use of vaccination if that was possible. And our aim at all times for any disease control response is to ensure that we minimise the impacts on people, the animals impacted, but also on the wider economy. Next slide, please.
I can talk to this, Ed, if you like.
Yeah, thank you, Steve.
So one thing that's key, probably on everyone's mind, is farmer compensation. Compensation entitlement would be triggered in an FMD outbreak. with the exercise of powers under the Biosecurity Act that 3 key points: damages or destroys property or places restriction of movement or disposal of goods causing economic loss. So on screen there, you'll see the type of loss that's covered and where compensation is considered. But key note at the bottom is that verification is required to show you the legal owner of the property, goods or stock directly affected with biosecurity response activities. So this is the same with Mycoplasma bovis, and there is some lessons learned there. I think we fully understand here that in order for the farming community to get back up and running quickly, there is, speed required here, and it needs to be timely in these payments and compensation back to farmers. So that process has improved over Mycoplasma bovis, and the team that is doing the compensation there, if we were to have an outbreak, would probably be very closely involved, if not switched from there into an FMD response if it was required. So front and center there we're trying to underpin all these plans and the planning that we're doing there, being farmer centric and understanding those pressure points that are required and refreshing them to the best of our ability. Next slide, if we could. So what can you do? On-farm biosecurity is a big point. All the issues we've talked through here today, or points we've talked to, if farmers, workers, support people are going overseas or traveling to Indonesia, and we ask that they declare risk goods. There has been some fantastic stories. A lot of people in farming communities are actually leaving their shoes behind and not bringing them back into the country, because that risk is there currently. You don't want to be that person. So animal products not to come in, as Mike spoke about, huge campaigns around this through the airports. One of the things that's been quite prevalent in this response is social media has been pushed to people in country. So as they're in Indonesia on one of our networks, they do get messages about it. So it's to raise that awareness. And the plea here is we urge anyone in contact with livestock in Indonesia stay away from farms and susceptible animals in New Zealand for a week. This is an illegal requirement, but it is something that we are pushing very, very strongly. Something for industry to probably take some responsibility here as well and encourage this doesn't occur. We really don't want that happening. So there's comprehensive information, Dairy NZ, Beef and Lamb, websites, DCANs, a lot of those processors involved with GIA are reviewing their websites and plans currently. They've got very good information, currently up to date, and so good sources of information to go through them. And equally raise any concerns you may have with them, and it gets feedback through to us. Key thing here, Ed's spoken about this, uncooked swill to pigs, those regulations are in place for a reason, so that's something we really encourage people not to do. And the big plea really from us here is to get familiar with the symptoms of FMD, understand what they are. As we mentioned, the Dairy NZ, Beef and Lamb websites, the MPI website also has this information, but drooling and smacking of the lips on stock, shivering, tender feet with sores and blisters, raised temperature, drop in milk yield and sore teats could all be indications of foot and mouth disease. Now, what we're asking here, there's a big difference between finding foot and mouth disease in 7 days than there is with finding it in 21. Because of the fast-moving nature of the virus, the sooner we can get onto that, the quicker and the least impact that will be. I have seen some of the questions coming through regarding restocking and so on. It's dependent somewhat on how quickly the outbreak can be identified, contained and controlled. The quicker that happens, the less impact it will have on overall. So that brings us to the end of the presentation, and thank you for your time.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, team, and a lot of information in a very short time. No doubt, plenty of questions. So please keep them coming in the chat there, and they'll get fed through to me. And hopefully, I can put them into some sort of an order that makes sense. I might just jump straight to you, probably Mike, on this one, which is around the importation of meat, effectively. And the question is, to reduce the risk, should we stop the importation of fresh pork for a period of time?
Yeah, we've got really strong import health standards across our system in terms of that regard, as well as the additional measures we've put in Indonesia. Our experience over the last period, we're certainly never going to be complacent, but across those countries that have already established FMD, we've been working with those countries, and our import health standards and are designed to deal with that risk. The reason for the enhanced measures in Indonesia is just to obviously get that balance right as they're going through their sort of response to that and the nature of it. So our import health standards, we believe, are strong in terms of the standards that we do, including our audits, etc., that we do, that we feel at this stage there is no need to do that.
So I'd also just add, Mike's absolutely right. I'd also just add, we don't import pork from countries that has foot and mouth disease, and then those import health standards are such that that the meat is being treated and packaged and all that sort of stuff in line with those really strict requirements. Similarly with Indonesia, we don't import any uncooked raw meat products from Indonesia, though highly manufactured processed products that come in from Indonesia specifically as well.
Okay. And so if there is any meat that comes in that is confiscated, is that tested for foot and mouth?
No.
Or are we typically just not seeing it?
Well, so no, it's not. As the main thing is that the stuff is found and it's destroyed and doesn't go any further. So that's really the most important thing is, as Ed explained earlier, one of the first few slides, for foot and mouth disease to get in here, it's really it's an untreated meat product coming in over the border, getting through, and then being fed to most likely pigs, to then go on and infect other animals. What we do find and know with the surveys and the audits we do of our border measures, look, the compliance is generally really high with people not bringing stuff in that they shouldn't. So the compliance is really high, and in our measures, are strong. When we do find something, it gets destroyed, and it doesn't go any further than the border where it's found.
So just on that, Stu, with the compliance being so high, I see there's a question here. Do you think the $400 fine is large enough? Is that enough of a deterrent, do you think, to keep people from doing this?
Yeah, look, good question, and yes, I mean that's certainly something that is debate and question around that. So look, I think what I would say on that is, and Mike can add to that. So the $400 is across the board, regardless. It's regardless of what you're carrying and who it is. So there is no discretion really applied to that. So there's a bit of getting a balance here for the person that's forgotten they had an apple or a mandarin in the bottom of their bag, or their child picked it up in Australia, it's the bottom of their bag, and they genuinely have forgotten. They receive a $400 fine. So there's a bit of a proportionate thing there. Also, though, really importantly for those people that are blatantly actually trying to smuggle, or whether there's malicious intent or illegal intent in terms of, like I say, trying to actually smuggle and bring something over that they know full well they're not allowed to do and they're hiding it, there is prosecution which follows. So it's not just the $400. There is a prosecution pathway with substantially significant higher penalties as a result of that process. So it is not just the $400 that's the only enforcement mechanism for that. And as I say, the $400, that's what it is currently, and it's I think it is set around providing a penalty, but also getting a bit of a balance for, like I say, we do get those people. We get those people who genuinely have forgotten they had that apple buried at the bottom of their bag.
Yeah, I can imagine if my kids did that, I wouldn't be overly happy. Yeah, in that scenario, yeah. I think one of the most eye-opening things for me was the slide there with the map of the world and the number of countries that do have it, but also the significance of the countries that don't have it, and the fact that they are some of our key trading partners and whatnot. There's a question here around the reports that China is talking about implementing export restrictions on products from New Zealand to reduce the risk of foot and mouth. Is there any truth in that? Or
no, look, yeah, there was some media on that last week. I'm not sure where that came out of, but no, there hasn't been any, there's been no products from New Zealand that have been prohibited or restricted into China as a result of FMD concerns. So yeah, that was not quite sure where that came from. I think it was last week in the media.
Okay. So if we were to have an outbreak here, what's the risk to our feral populations, our pigs, our deer, our goats, and then obviously how do we manage that?
I think Steve, you've been leading.
Yeah, I can. We have been looking at this. We've been talking with Doc around particularly where farms with border dock estates and so on as what would be the process for that, and it is a big concern with that, and looking at control mechanisms. Obviously, if a wild population does get FMD into it, there's a recovery element to that as well. It's not all about leaving an animal in the bush or in those areas that has FMD. It's got to be recovered because obviously this is all about stop movement and movement control for that to stop that spread. So part of the policy work that's been worked through currently is whether a controlled area notice could be put on bordering land, which would allow culling and recovery at a high level. But it comes down to practicality as well, and whether that is viable probably in the first instance, given some of the expenses that we've got. And so what options would be there? One thing they have found with some wild populations of animals in some of the studies overseas is that wild population, they're not dense. So the way that the herds are together, they're not in close proximity like they are, say, in cattle and milking sheds or pigs on a farm. So therefore the spread hasn't been as great. But it is something that will have to be monitored very, very closely at the time. We are working with Doc on, they do have an ungulate plan on this and how that would be looked at, but it's a very valid question.
If I might just add to that, Steve, the other important thing is that people with domestic livestock can put measures in place to protect their animals that they own from the feral population. So it's about keeping your animals safe.
Good point, Ed. Yeah. I guess what work has been done in planning for the hard borders and why they're not already washdown areas in Picton and Wellington? So yeah, are we ready for the worst case to happen and things do get shut down, and what does that look like here?
Yeah, so look, I mean, so we don't have, I guess to the, the Picton or Cook Strait stuff, well, so we don't have foot and mouth in New Zealand. And so, we don't need to have things domestically for moving people or animals around because we don't have it. In terms of the border, so, yeah, we've put those things in place over and above for Indonesia. Were we to have a more significant outbreak like Australia, look, Australia getting a case or getting a confirmed outbreak, Mike and the border team, have been doing a lot of planning around what that would look like. It would mean a significant ramping up of things on the border at the airports with cargo, with mail, very different to Indonesia at the moment, where, we're talking really low numbers and no direct flights from Indonesia. So that would be really different, of course. We'd ramp up, we'd immediately stop more things coming in here in terms of, things that people can carry on their person, etc. We're also doing, in those discussions and planning with the airports, with our colleagues at customs in terms of, how we would manage all of that. Mike, did you want to expand a little bit on that?
No, we're working with the task force team and Steve Ham. So as well as engaging with airports and ports, part of those scenarios is obviously Australia, Pacific Islands, ourselves in New Zealand. So in terms of what we've done so far with Indonesia, in terms of scalability, we've looked at that in terms of how we would continue to do that, and also then balance what we've found through those aspects, whether it's container checks, and then how would we escalate. And depending on our trading agreements with other countries, that will depend on the actions we take in terms of cease and import health goods, etc. So it would ramp up significantly, particularly if it came closer, and depending on the nature of trade we have.
Okay. From slightly a different tack, then maybe also around biosecurity on farm, and I guess what's required of the likes of MPI or Osprey officers and whatnot when they do come on farm. And I also probably there's another question there that leads into that as well, is do we have enough disinfectant and whatnot for for the worst case scenario as well? How are we prepared in that situation?
Well, look, so on farm, some of the stuff that's already been mentioned, I think it was mentioned in in the chat. NATE records critical, and we found that with Mycoplasma bovis as well. So good NATE records, and knowing where animals have gone or have been. So that's a huge part of it. The on-farm biosecurity practices. To be able to respond to and manage something like this. We are working really closely with the likes of Beef and Lamb, Dairy New Zealand. They do have good information around all of this as well. It's certainly a big part of the program going forward too, that everyone can help here. I think it goes back as well to if we were to have a case of foot and mouth disease, the thing is to find it as quickly as possible, contain it as quickly as possible, so that we can really minimize the spread and deal with it as quickly and as localized as possible, which again is where knowing where animals have been, NATE records, etc. comes in. Steve, did you want to add to that and talk to the disinfectant supply and all that sort of stuff as well?
So that is a key piece of work. So there's one I mentioned 26 projects. One is stores and equipment in there itself. So they're looking at all options for disinfectant bars, how that could be used. And so that's key piece there. Currently there's very good stores of this in the country now. I think the key point here too is we don't have foot and mouth disease here currently, and any response would ramp up in that time. So it's about having the access to that supply, ensuring base levels are in the country at any one time, so that we know we can access quickly to be used in response. But it does all come down to that speed overall of actually identifying those farms. As far as MPI, Osprey, other officers, once again, there's going to be an awareness there. Whether we wouldn't expect that currently now with our FMD in the country, with it at all, but obviously they're a critical part as well. As is with milk tankers and anyone else carriers that's coming on farm as well, as understanding your responsibilities and what could be required in a response as far as disinfection and control is required if it was needed.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Stephen. I remember when I met with your team there a couple of weeks back, and a discussion while I was there was the point was made that if the disease was to make it all the way from Indonesia through travel, through our airports and all our screening, and through the hotel and back through the transport home and eventually get to farm, the likelihood of that happening is quite or extremely low. But then on top of that, if you were to have disinfectant on your farm, the likelihood of it getting through that disinfectant then at the end of the day is just another extreme, kind of a sledgehammer on top of all of that to really wipe that out. So I thought that was an extremely good point that was made there. We might just touch on PKE. I know it's a hot topic. That's a palm kernel. Do you want to go through around the risks of palm kernel and what you found there?
Yeah, so yeah, PKE, obviously, we use a fair bit of it in New Zealand for feed. Indonesia, Malaysia, the countries we get it from. So PKE generally, there's a low risk that PKE will carry viable FMD into New Zealand. There's a few things associated with that. There has been a lot of work done around this. First is the actual manufacturing process to manufacture the PKE, the heat and the temperatures involved, and the time over which it has processed really, means that even if FMD were on it when it lands up in the processing facility, it would be killed through that process. And then what we have in place, that import health standards, requirements that we've talked about for PKE, we have really strict import health standard requirements in place around PK in terms of, where it's manufactured, how it is stored, transported, and then shipped to New Zealand, and the conditions under which that needs to occur. In terms of that storage at the manufacturing facilities, the requirements are that it needs to be stored in secure locations, without access or any animals being able to access, birds, etc., and then the transportation and the storage of it. What we do and have done over the years is we do audits of Indonesia and Malaysia in terms of having assurance that all those requirements are actually being followed and adhered to. With Indonesia, with the news in May of foot and mouth disease over there, we last prior to June, our last audit in Indonesia had been last year. And that was a virtual video audit because of COVID. We couldn't travel. So what we did in June, we sent a couple of our staff over to Indonesia on the ground over there to do a visual audit inspection of facilities to really have a first-hand look on the ground. They through that audit on the ground in Indonesia, they found everything meeting the standards and the requirements to a high standard actually. So that's a ground truthing exercise that does give us the confidence that the process is all being followed and adhered to very strictly with PKE from Indonesia and Malaysia as well.
Yeah. And do you think we've seen a lift in the standards there in those processing facilities and whatnot over the last, say, 5 to 10 years? And what's the importance for them to have such high standards, Stu?
Yeah, so no, look, thanks, Wayne. Yes, we have. So, over the last 5-10 years, we jointly with those countries have put a lot of focus and effort on it. So undoubtedly there has been a lift. They do take the trade with us really seriously. We are, I think I'm not sure if we're the biggest purchaser. We may be, but I think there's a very small number of countries that actually purchase PKE in any significant quantity for those processing facilities. So we are certainly right up there. I think the Netherlands might be the other country. So they do. So the owners of the facilities appreciate the importance of actually meeting the requirements and taking it seriously. And the Indonesian government are very well aware of why we have such a strict requirement in place. They do take it very seriously. They were anticipating, when we asked if we could send a couple of people over in June, didn't really come as a surprise to them that we'd asked that, and they were kind of anticipating that given the FMD news, we would want to come and have a look. So we have had, like I say, that on the ground visibility of the measures.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and has there been any work done around the, economic impact of what an outbreak would do to New Zealand?
Yeah, so I think you may have seen in some of the news reports recently with this news. Previous work has been done. I think showing of the order of about $16 billion over I think it might be 5 years or so. We're just refreshing and revising that economic analysis of what the impacts would be. It's still sort of that order. It does, it does depend on the extent and scale of an FMD outbreak here. If it were small and we contained it quickly, as opposed to if it's spread across the entire country. So that does play into it. But look, it's significant, and it goes back to the fact that trade would effectively stop initially, and then we would need to work really quickly to find, contain it, get rid of it, and then really quickly go through that process of trying to reopen up markets to get our product moving and into markets.
No, I bet. I think the $16 billion figure would be lowballing, if anything, in my opinion. But I guess from moving to a more practicality point of view, some of the questions here around, this might be for Ed or Steve, maybe around the disposal of animals and such. If you're talking about burning animals, how would that be done in the likes of a summer dry situation?
So as Steve said earlier, we're looking at all of our key plans at this with this FMD task force, and we've got a number of different options for disposal, safe and secure disposal of carcasses, including mass burial, burial on farm, burning potentially, although not without risk, and also speaking to people with incinerators and considering other options like composting, etc. So we are looking at all options for carcass disposal. It would be a huge logistics exercise depending on the number of properties and the type of properties impacted. But we're very mindful of the constraints within New Zealand. I would hope that we wouldn't see UK 2001 revisited, to be honest. And we had the pyres.
Yeah, absolutely. And has there been any thought into how we would restock the country should the worst happen? Steve, I think you've done some work in that space.
Yeah, I and it's a very good question, but the answer really is it depends. Whether if it's quite localized and you were to stamp this out quite quickly in a localized area, then restocking could occur from other parts of the country into there. The scenarios that you're working through would be very large scale, where I think that restocking, there were some questions in our last meeting around live imports there too. I don't know if that would be an option at that point, but yeah, unfortunately it just comes down to what is the scale and size of the issue and the outbreak. How quickly you get onto that will dictate what restocking could look like. So I'm sorry, it's probably not the answer you want directly, but unfortunately with a lot of this, it does what we're trying to get here. The sooner you do get onto something, the sooner you can contain it and keep it localized, the less the impact there would be and strain on the system.
Okay, cool. And then just talking about NATE as well, obviously you talked about it being an essential tool for the spread. Sheep are not currently part of NATE. We've seen the Australians move to put sheep as part of their NATE system. What's the plan with the New Zealand? What's the thinking around that?
So yeah, look, sheep, obviously sheep aren't part of NATE at the moment. What we're doing with that, so we've got between ourselves with Osprey and Beef and Lamb, we are doing some work around looking at the options around sheep. to see how can we get a better handle on sheep movements for what a disease like FMD or something else. The electronic ASD animal status declaration. So Osprey's recently moved to an electronic format of that. That potentially could be a good first step in terms of tracking and moving sheep at the mob level. So that's certainly something between the three of us, that we're working on and looking at. So that work's underway as part of this FMD task force. And if we can get something even to start with that gives us better traceability for sheep, and it could be something down the track that gets further work as well. But that's the starting point for us with the sheep question.
Okay. Steve, I know you've talked about the plan having has it 23 or 27 prongs to it. How are you socializing that and making sure that everyone's engaging with it and effectively ready for ready to hit go?
So there's almost a trifecta with the planning that's currently underway. One is with our GIA partners. So the Livestock Sector Biosecurity Council has been receptive. So your chief executives from Dairy New Zealand, DCANS, Beef and Lamb, and actually Federated Farmers will be soon as a member shortly as well. And all the industry parties, pork, equine, all those industries are represented there. And the key part that we're looking at there from the policy work and the plans that have been established is industry will actually look over those plans and have input into them. So there is a workshop planned for the 6th, 7th and 8th of September, where there'll be industry bodies poring over the policy work there as well. The biggest thing, it's fine to have a policy, but it's difficult if it can't be implemented. So there's a heavy focus on implementation around those plans. Equally, that's also occurring with other government agencies. So there is a question here around welfare. One thing we do really want to bottom out with MSD, IRD is those welfare questions and actually have that work done. Checkpoints, roadblocks, obviously police, defence. We need to make sure that the plans are implementable also by other agencies. And if there's any lessons from COVID, there we know that social licence, things were waning towards the end there as well with that. So it's about having these controls in place, but creating the least amount of impact that we could. And that's all part of the refresh and uplift we're looking with these plans for them. So two things there. There's MPI almost in the middle, drafting these, industry having input into those plans and policies to make sure it's going to work. Milk collection is a big point. Stock in transit is a big point that we really need to bottom out with industry around this. If there was to be an outbreak and stock was being moved from farm to processing or North and South Island and it did get stuck, what does it mean for animal welfare? How do we manage those systems and process? So we're doing a lot of work with industry currently on those. Milk collection is the other one. It's high risk, but if processing is occurring with milk and you get the pasteurization commercially, then potentially with permitting it can be allowed. So it's keeping things going and being really, really conscious of that and working with industry around those key points.
Okay, and so just along those lines as well, how do we staff that? How do we get a big enough team? I think in your slide there, you thought it was a team of 3,000. We've already got a labour shortage. What work's being done in that space?
There's a whole project dedicated to workforce planning around the response, and there are different requirements at different times within a response. One thing we've been quite overwhelmed with, and as huge as the amount of industry support in this, a number of works, different people have come forward saying if there's anything there, our workforce is available. So, there's a lot of industry support here too, also from iwi as well. I think post-COVID, there's a recognition that we do have to lean in this together. And we say a workforce of 3,000, obviously MPI couldn't do that. And ourselves, that would be our whole workforce almost out. doing it, but there's expertise in certain areas that we would be leaning on. It's about identifying that expertise early, and making sure we have plans in place and prepared for that. So have had a lot of support.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, Steve, we also have international agreements in place with other countries to access science and specialist expertise. And we're working very closely with the veterinary communities in New Zealand to ensure that we've got a shared understanding of perspectives and who might do what should the worst happen.
Okay, and I guess there was a question earlier around how are we socialising this, not just with the farmer community, but also the wider New Zealand public, and so that is the team of 5 million that's keeping it up.
Yeah, no, look, that's absolutely. This is not just a farming problem at all, and it's not all on farmers to be aware and do all the right things. It's very much everyone playing their part and everyone coming into New Zealand doing their bit to protect New Zealand. Look, the messaging and the information Mike referred to at the border, that's really directed at anyone coming in here. The message we've been trying to get across through with that as well is play your part in protecting New Zealand. We've been doing quite a lot of these sort of engagements, and it's not just focused on farming groups. And we will continue to do more of that, and wherever we do have the opportunity to get the message more broadly out, we will be doing so. We've done radio stuff. I think I did something with a local Indian radio station. We've done the same with Chinese communities. So we are trying to reach far and wide. It's an excellent point, and this is not just about farmers and the agriculture sector all doing the right thing. It's about everyone actually doing their bit to protect New Zealand here.
Great point, Stu. Yeah. Just before we close off, could you touch on just again why we would not just use a vaccine? What's the implications of vaccinations and
Ed, you're muted.
Just on me.
So there can be
did so well.
Yeah, to be one. Potential impacts on trade with vaccinated cattle. You're not at liberty to trade as easily cattle that have been, or other stock that have been vaccinated. So there would be longer term implications in terms of retaining our current trading status. The preference would be to not have to use vaccination. Having said that, it can be a useful tool as far as ring fencing if we've got an area that we're finding difficult to control, or we're wanting to keep it out of spreading into a wider area. So it's definitely part of our toolkit, and it's one that we keep continually under review and refresh in case we do find ourselves having to use it.
Nice. Okay, I think I better wrap it up there as we come near 1 o'clock. Thank you very much. I realise that there might be a few more questions in the chat that aren't answered, but we'll certainly pass them on and have them sent out and get answered for those that have tuned in. I guess from my position and what Feds have been doing in the space, as I mentioned recently, I headed up to Auckland Airport and the mail centre to have a look around and see what was going on in terms of the processes. One thing that struck me, I think, was the volumes. You think it is a massive volume of both people and mail and whatnot coming into the country. However, it really isn't. We're talking around 100 people a day, or not a significant amount of mail. So it was great to see how thoroughly they were being inspected and treated, and how seriously this was being taken. The signs and the awareness throughout the airport could not be missed. And that's why I'm glad to hear that the $400 fine is for anyone that has missed it, because really you shouldn't be able to miss it heading into the airport. I think as farmers, we need to put our hand up too and make sure that all our procedures are in place. As mentioned, any staff coming back from over that direction, really important to make sure they do quarantine for a certain time, potentially 1 week to 10 days. As mentioned, some disinfectant at the cow shed to really, as I mentioned, put the sledgehammer on anything that was potentially thinking of coming through and now couldn't get onto the farm. And also, obviously, traceability, keeping our NAT up to date, making that system as best as we can. So should the worst ever happen, we can get right on top of it and stop the movement and hopefully open the country back up again, should we ever get into that situation. So I thank you all for your time. I thank Stu and his team for such a thorough presentation and the ability to answer the questions so freely and openly. It's fantastic to see, and it's great that everyone's been putting so much thought into it. So I thank everyone that's come on the call, and remember, if you have missed any of it, that it is being recorded and you better watch it again in future times. So thanks again, and I'll sign off from there from Federated Farmers Policy Presents.